A todos y a todas. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the third roundtable discussion on addressing the climate crisis in a context of geopolitical conflict. We have some problems with the connection. Okay. We are delighted to be here and very grateful to the organizers, in particular for the warm Colombian welcome that we have received. And I'm very all the more honored to be moderating this roundtable discussion with such distinguished speakers. I will start with Professor Thomas Cottier, Professor Emeritus of International and European Law and Senior Fellow at the World Trade Organization, as well as current arbitrator of the MPIA, followed by EU Ambassador Gilles Bertrand to the Republic of Colombia, Professor of Practice Jennifer Hillman at Georgetown Law Center, and last but certainly not least, Professor Gabrielle Marceau, Senior Counsellor at the WTO Secretariat and Associate Professor of Law at the University of Geneva. So the topic of our roundtable discussion today, addressing the climate crisis in a context of geopolitical conflict, is, unlike perhaps previous roundtable discussions we had, certainly not new. The international community, as you know, has been trying to address the climate change for over 20 years now, since the adoption of the UN FCC. And yet, I don't think we have seen such a degree of attention to climate change and the climate crisis among international economic lawyers as we are seeing today. I think this is evident from the program of our conference. I don't think I have been at a session in our conference where climate change didn't come up for one reason or another. But also, as Gabrielle was telling us, even in discussions in the WTO, climate change seems to be everywhere nowadays, in every corridor, in every committee. And I think there are three main reasons for that, and it's on the broad themes on which our speakers will be giving some thoughts. The first is, I think, what I will call the reality of the problem, is the fact that climate change is happening, and its adverse effects are being felt in all the regions of the world, even though not in an even manner. So we're no longer talking about the threat of climate change, as you were saying, Jennifer, but the reality of climate change and indeed the climate crisis. The second reason, I think, has to do with the nature of the response, how countries around the world are responding or trying to address the climate crisis, and the fact that an increasing number of countries, not only in the global north, but also in the global south, are using trade-related measures, from subsidies to market access measures, to address the climate crisis, which pushes us, as international economic lawyers and trade lawyers, to rethink current WTO rules and whether they are appropriate to manage these regulatory responses. And the third reason is the context, the current context of geopolitical conflict, which of course is making international cooperation on fighting climate change all the more challenging and difficult, like in other areas, cooperation in other areas of international relations, but it also raising questions, as we saw from the roundtable discussion yesterday, as to whether we should be viewing climate change as a security, so through the prism of national security. And I know there are different views around the table and in the room on that. So on these broad themes, our speakers will be providing some critical insights, some critical views. Unfortunately, we lost our main voice from the global south, Santiago Vils, who couldn't join us due to work commitments in Geneva. And so what I want to do, one of my main objectives as chair, is to make sure that we have at least 15 or 20 minutes for a question and answer session with the audience. And I'm in particular inviting those voices from the global south in the audience to please think about challenging questions for our distinguished speakers. So without taking more of my time as moderator, I will now turn to Professor Thomas Cottier, who has very kindly agreed to start off the discussion by offering some general global perspective on our topic. So how do you think our current geopolitical context is affecting the global response to the climate crisis?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marceau. I think the geopolitical tensions have resonated in all the two previous roundtables and in many of the panels. And of course, we all know that geopolitics also loom large in the background of international economic law. Mostly people assume that they know what the tension is, but I'm trying to speak out and say, I guess it's about the United States defending hegemony. It's about China challenging the hegemony, and it's about Russia claiming a lost empire. And all the rest of the world is caught in between somehow in a very messy situation here. In the longer run, I think these conflicts will open up new dividing lines. And as a lawyer, I think it's interesting for me to think that these dividing lines are essentially in the law. I consider the rule of law to be a fundamental dividing line, separation of powers, and freedom of expression. Of course, the world is very messy, and it's very difficult to distinguish between, ever since the old Greeks, between democracy and autocracy. But I think these dividing lines will eventually translate also into our own field. And that is, of course, a great challenge, because international economic law is essentially colorblind. We don't ask for a particular political system to be adhered to become a member of the WTO or to any other of these international universal organizations here. But eventually, as these political systems are being threatened, they respond back by using trade measures. And that, of course, is not new. I just recall Lowenfeld's book about trade controls for political end, published in 1983. So this is not new, and we have to live with this in many of the subjects we were discussing, including what you just mentioned about national security relates to that. But I think if we go all down the line, we probably will end up in new trade blocks of like-minded countries along the lines of the divide in a very messy situation here. And of course, this will, in terms of international law, boil down that relations among different political systems will boil down to the law of coexistence, the classical international law, perhaps also even warfare under the Geneva Conventions here, while cooperation will be limited to like-minded countries. And that will leave us in the end to a new generation of trade blocs. That's the raw picture, and that is, of course, very, very bad news for climate change policies, because climate change policies inherently depend on close international cooperation. We simply cannot solve the problem without international cooperation among also non-like-minded countries. We need cooperation even between governments who may be rivals in other areas here. We have climate change mitigation. In the end of the day, it boils down to adopt a common carbon price, or at least methodologies to define carbon pricing here. It's very difficult to do without this here. And that entails cooperation of all the major polluting countries. We have climate change adaptation, which hasn't been talked about much in this conference so far, but which probably is at the center for most countries. It affects nutrition and it affects migration, a topic we haven't even talked in the WTO context beyond Mode 4 and labor mobility here. But if we're not able to control climate change, we will see massive migration, not only within countries, but also across boundaries. And that will, I don't need to stress that, greatly put a lot of governments at risk here and add to the turmoil. We also have climate change communication. We cannot succeed in climate change if there is not sufficient awareness. And in many countries around the world, there is not sufficient awareness of this because there is no freedom of information. And so this is another point where we need to stress our cooperation. Now, how can we do this? How can we bridge the divide between the law of coexistence in power politics and all these areas and the need for close cooperation? And my suggestion would be here to you that we use the principle of common concern of humankind. The common concern of humankind was recognized in the preambles of the UNFCCC and in the Paris Accord. It's also recognized in the Biodiversity Convention and some others here. But we as lawyers haven't done much out of this so far. It stands there in the preambles, but we have not operationalized this in terms of an obligation to cooperate, in an obligation to do our homework, and also in disciplines on compliance here. And I would urge the community of international economic lawyers and the WTO lawyers to explore the potential of this principle as we apply it to bring about greater cooperation in the field where cooperation is absolutely necessary if we want to succeed, despite all the realities of geopolitics, as I tried to describe them very briefly.
Thank you very much, Professor Cottier, for those general remarks. I will now turn to Ambassador Gilles Bertrand for you to follow up with a new perspective on our topic, and in particular, similar question, how do you think the current geopolitical context is shaping the EU response to the climate crisis, not only in relation to your cooperation with Colombia, which obviously you know very well in Latin America, but more broadly?
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation in such a space for reflection among distinguished economic lawyers. I'm not a lawyer, so you will have to excuse me if I say things that do not sound entirely academic on a few things, but I can try to bring in a bit of a well, practitioner's view, so to speak. But I think to start with, we had a very clear example last year of a potential conflict between our green agenda and geopolitical realities in the shape of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And there were quite a few people in the EU who were like, sort of quietly thinking, so the Green Pact and the Green Deal, etc., are going to be sort of put on the back burner for a while. And they were quite disappointed because in the end, if you look back to the last year and a half, if you look back to the speed at which we, well, detoxed from Russian oil and gas, when you look back to the way we've accelerated in many ways some of the transitions that we were working on, I think so far we've managed to actually show that not only the Russian invasion of Ukraine was not going to delay the agenda, but in fact, possibly it was going to accelerate it. And we did it because we just feel that time is running out. Time is running out to fix the mess that has been created on our planet. And that there was no way we could just sort of suspend many of the processes we had started just because geopolitical realities were coming to us. We are also aware, and I think that's a factor many of the countries on the planet are aware of, but not all, that the later and the slower the action, well, the costlier and the harder it will be. So it's really a question of the faster you act, the better placed you are in a way to avoid the worst effects. And I think I think Professor Cottier was right when he said that the first thing you need for climate change and for tackling climate change is a very strong international cooperation. There's no way you can actually do anything on implementing the Paris Agreement, the rather ambitious Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, if you're not cooperating internationally. And that element is actually something where we have to be very clear. That also means that even when you may have other countries or other blocs that do not share very fundamental values, if there is a convergence on that element of combating climate change together, this in itself is essential, and this in itself requires to continue cooperation, at least on that particular point, and give it a certain element of priority, because we all depend on it. For the rest, what we feel is that we need to convince as many countries as we can of the need to change deeply the way international finance works, to scale up finance for forests and biodiversity, to work on green taxonomy, to be able basically to build a greener financial environment for the planet. That also is something that you cannot do just on your own, but we feel that if the EU and a number of other like-minded countries, and as I said, countries that may not share many of our ideas on how to run our political systems, that may share that objective of tackling climate change, agree on this, then we feel that we can actually make quite a lot of progress. We believe in promoting sustainable value chains. You probably know this is something on which we talk a lot in this country, the regulation on deforestation, where we are trying to basically get a guarantee that the products that are, at least on 6 products to start with, that they are not produced on deforested land, or at least land that was deforested after 2021. This is an example also of how you can use your market to make sure that at least your consumers get a guarantee that they are not consuming products that are the result of a continued degradation of the environment. And we feel also that we need to protect as much space as possible for international cooperation on research and innovation. And that there again, if we can have a multifaceted engagement with all partner countries that are ready to work on this, to work or to basically promote scientific cooperation, whether it's on forests, on biodiversity, on circular economy, on well, this is actually something that has to be done. That's one of the reasons, for instance, why we have run a rather open approach to our Copernicus program, our system of Earth observation, where we consider that all the partners that can actually benefit from the work of Copernicus to advance their green agendas should be able to do so without obstacles. And just to sort of conclude these very first remarks, I think precisely the relationship between the EU and Colombia is a good example of how well it works when you share the same values, you share the same level of priority on climate change, on particularly the fight against the loss of biodiversity. But when you look over the last years, say, comparing with 5 years ago, Colombia has become a very close partner of the EU at the world level, at the regional level, and also at the national level. At the world level, in particular, on the whole issue of biodiversity. I mean, this country is a giant in biodiversity, and we've worked very closely, for instance, on the work we achieved in Montreal last year between the EU and Colombia. Regionally, in particular, on the preservation of the Amazon, because of course we talk about all the systemic issues, but you also have, what was that? Yeah, sorry. You also have a couple of wild cards on the planet, and for instance, if you lose the Amazon, you're just losing the world's climate, and you might have done everything right on all the rest, but this will not be enough. And on the Amazon, starting from the Leticia Pact, continuing with what was going on last weekend, Leticia as well, the pre-Amazon Summit meeting that Brazil and Colombia organized. There's a very strong cooperation there also with the EU. And nationally, whether you look at the support to the adaptation of the Colombian economy, you look at how we are trying to encourage relations between green, the spreading of green innovation between our research communities, cooperation between not just large companies, but also small and medium enterprises on green innovation. You actually realize that there is a whole ecosystem there that works extremely well and that has improved. I've been the EU ambassador in this country for 2 years. I've already welcomed twice the Environment Commissioner. The last visit was this weekend for the summit in Leticia, and once the Vice President of the Commission for Climate Change. It just gives you an example of the intensity of contacts, and that goes without mentioning all the contacts ahead of the various COPs, during the COPs, during all the meetings that take place. Compare it with 5 or 10 years ago, and this is incomparable. And that's an example of what can be done when the like-mindedness is there. And I believe that actually the more we manage to build alliances like the one we have between the EU and Colombia, the more we can actually act, as I said, fast enough and boldly enough so that it's actually less costly and less dangerous for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Perhaps I will follow up quickly with a question to both of you to offer some additional reflections on your intervention. I think you both highlighted the fact that climate change should be seen as a matter of common concern, and I think there will be no disagreement on that, no disagreement among reasonable people at least, and that the answer is cooperation, and you both emphasize that a lot in your initial interventions, and cooperation not between only like-minded states, but also between like-minded and not like-minded states. Yet, Ambassador Bertrand, there's been a lot of cooperation in the EU response to the climate crisis, but there's been not only cooperation, there's also been a clear assertive move by the EU to go unilaterally in its response. I mean, you refer to the deforestation regulation, but there are other measures as well that the EU has adopted as part of the Green Deal that are unilateral in tenure. I'm wondering how you see that unilateral response by the EU and the effects that it can have on whether it risks putting at risk that cooperation that is needed, not only between like-minded states, as you are emphasizing, but between also with not like-minded states, as Professor Cottier was. So are we risking ended up in what he was referring as a messy situation where you only have cooperation between like-minded states, but at the end of the day, that's not enough to protect the global climate?
Yeah, I would adopt cooperation in very broad terms, and it isn't something where you only move if you agree on each and every stage. We know in trade policy that unilateral measures are very important to move an agenda forward here, and it's not different in the area of the environment and climate change. And we've seen the effect of unilateral measures adopted by the EU now actually waking up the international trade community to face the challenges which they dodged so far. So I think we need a philosophy of carrot and sticks, and under a broad umbrella of cooperation.
I think the whole logic of I mean, as long as you are one of the largest markets on the planet. If you don't take action and if you leave space for things to go on as usual, they go on as usual. So what led us to that idea that we should actually start acting unilaterally on some very specific elements is exactly that. You have to use the weight of the EU market to accelerate the changes in the way I'm saying in Professor Cottier was just saying. But when we do it, we are aware that this comes with adaptation costs, and this comes with, and just to give the example of the deforestation regulation, this is something on which we've been working now for more than 2 years with Colombian partners, with the gremios, the professional organizations of the producers of the products concerned by this first batch of the regulation to adapt. And what we keep saying, and what is really our line here in particular, is of course we don't want the regulation to have a negative impact neither on the volume nor on the quality of trade. We actually want a positive impact. We want more products that you can consider organic, deforestation free, etc. And we actually want these products, I mean, we wanted a quantitative increase in these products. It's not a question also of protecting our markets, because most of these products we don't produce. So, you know, you're talking about things, commodities that we need in the EU, where our consumers want to be certain that they are not consuming products that are the consequence of unsustainable practices. But the logic is actually to work with the producers to make sure that they will actually even turn that into a success. And I will go even further. We want this to be a success, particularly here, because we need to be able to go to countries that are less convinced than Colombia about the fight against climate change, and to show them that EU-Colombia trade has actually benefited from that first mover effect, and that their producers should actually adapt. That's one example, but this is really the approach that we try to have. And I think it's a way of exerting our responsibility, but still being aware of the cost of change and of the need to accompany the change to avoid situations where that would actually backfire against what we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you very much. I will have quite a few follow-up questions on both of your interventions, but I'm sure there will be more coming from the audience. In the benefit of time, I'm going to turn now to Professor Jennifer Hillman, who's going to offer some critical perspective from the US on its response to the climate crisis in recent years, and in particular, the Inflation Reduction Act to begin with.
Great, thank you. And it's really a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank the SIEL organizers and everyone for including me. I wanted to just touch a little bit on what the United States has done in this climate change space, and then give you some thoughts or my takeaways on what to make of that. I think if you step back and look at it, for the last 20 years, the US approach to fighting climate change has been, until very recently, largely based on regulation. Regulating the amount of emissions, and that cuts across the entire swath of the US economy. As a result, if you look at it, US greenhouse gas emissions have fallen by 20% since 2005. So I mean, these regulations are having a bite in terms of pushing companies to reduce their emissions. But it's pretty clear that the Biden administration and the Congress realized this was not enough. I mean, that we were simply not going to get there by regulation alone. And so a major pivot happened, a year and a half ago when the Biden administration came in to put the United States heavily on the road of industrial policy and massive new subsidies. So 3 major funding bills. For those of you that were at the first panel discussion yesterday, you heard Amy Porges touch on these. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the so-called CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. Collectively, these 3 bills mean that the federal government in the United States will literally triple the amount of spending that it's devoting to climate change and clean energy in this decade compared to where we were in the 2010s. This likely means a reduction by 50% of the total amount of greenhouse gases emitted in the United States if you look at what is expected by 2030 as compared to where we were in 2005. It also means that the United States is likely to become a major global manufacturer of green-related products and materials. So again, some major implications. Of these, the biggest of the acts was clearly the Inflation Reduction Act, and it's also the one that's raised the most controversy in the geopolitical context. This bill provides literally hundreds of billions of dollars in clean energy incentives, loans, tax credits, and direct payments. More than 60 individual provisions spread throughout this bill that go directly to the issues of climate and green energy. But it's raised the hackles of many of our trading partners. And I think for two major reasons. One is just the sheer size and the magnitude of this bill. I mean, in theory, if you think about what those grants, those loans, those tax credits do, at some level, they also unleash the power of the private sector. So this bill is expected to have not just billions, but $1 trillion or trillions of dollar impact in the US economy, which has then caused everybody else in the world to say, hey, wait a minute here. The sheer size of those numbers means you are drawing in investments into the United States, where everybody is going to start making their electric vehicles, their clean energy in the United States rather than at home. And that presents competitive issues for a lot of other countries. But secondly, are the specific provisions within the bill, for example, related to electric vehicles. You get a $7,500 tax credit to buy an electric vehicle if the electric vehicle was assembled in North America, and if a certain portion, 40% of the critical minerals and 50% of the components in the battery that goes into the electric vehicle, and let's be honest, the battery is the key component, have to be made in the United States or in a country with which the United States has a free trade agreement. All right. A lot of those last provisions were obviously pushed at trying to reduce reliance on China, which has 61% of the world's lithium and 90% of the electrode, the battery making components is all done in China. But, the United States didn't, as Vera really clearly pointed out, they didn't do the math. They did not do the math before this bill passed. So all of a sudden, oops, we look around and say, can we actually meet these requirements that 40% of the components be made in the United States, that so much percentage of the critical minerals be coming from the United States or a free trade agreement partner? No, we can't meet those. So all of a sudden you started this effort to find workarounds. So we negotiated a critical minerals agreement with Japan. We're now in the process of negotiating a critical minerals agreement with the European Union. We decided to declare that if a car is leased as opposed to purchased outright, and leasing cars is a very common practice in the United States, it doesn't count for the assembled in North America requirement. So foreign electric vehicles can come in as long as they are leased but not sold to American consumers. So a whole lot of workarounds, in this IRA. The second, kind of completely different initiative that the United States has then started in the climate change area is the negotiation of the Global Arrangement on Sustainable Steel and Aluminum, sometimes referred to by the very nasty acronym of GASA or GASA in the United States. It's being negotiated between the European Union and the United States. Again, makes sense. Steel and aluminum are, themselves very large greenhouse gas emitters. 8% of all GHGs come from steel producing, 4% from aluminum. So if you could rein in those two alone, you're really doing something serious about more than 12% of total global greenhouse gas emission. The idea behind it is that the EU and the US are both going to impose a tariff on steel and aluminum imports from any country that is not a member of this club. And in order to get into the club, you have to do three things. You have to produce steel and aluminum at emissions standards levels that have been agreed upon as part of this deal. Secondly, you have to commit not to overproduce steel and aluminum. And thirdly, you have to limit the activity of state-owned enterprises. Again, obviously a dig or a direction at China to try to make sure that China would be kept out of this arrangement. So where does this stand? There's a lot of work going on right now. My understanding is it's getting pretty bogged down in debates over how do we measure these emissions and what is exactly the standard that's going to be set. But, again, underlying it are, I think, problems with the competing goals by which the US and the EU came into this. For the United States, the major goal was to get the European Union on board fighting China. For the European Union, the major goal was to get out from under the 232, the national security tariffs that had been imposed on steel and aluminum. So when I step back from that and say, okay, what is my kind of takeaway of this sort of new approach of the United States to go down this industrial policy subsidy road? I mean, what should we make of this? For me, three key takeaways to sort of think about in this room. The first for me is how noticeable it was that during the debate on the Inflation Reduction Act, which clearly had unequivocal local content requirements in it, nobody said, oops, what about our WTO obligations? Just what about that? It used to be, and maybe I'm dating myself, when I was the general counsel at USTR, it used to be that USTR officials, State Department officials, Justice Department officials would at least say, hey, whoa, hold on here. Let's think about whether we need to be doing this in a way that is so clearly violating our WTO obligations. But it's very clear that is of significantly lesser concern in the United States today, particularly when it comes to climate change and national security measures. And that fact alone, the US doesn't really care whether it's violating the WTO, to me is something that should be of substantial concern. The second, for me, major takeaway is that the United States in all of these initiatives has mixed up the goal. It says the goal is climate change, climate change, climate change, but also, and the alsos are always about the two driving agendas in the United States right now. The number one driving agenda in the United States is pushing back on China. The number two agenda in the United States is creating jobs and creating a technology advantage for the United States. And so all of these measures are combining those two goals. And to me, again, that's very problematic. A, it undermines the effectiveness for climate change purposes if you're going to mix in all of these other goals. And the undermining is most clear when you think about the pushback on China, because it's really clear we cannot solve the climate change problem without China. China is by far, far, far the largest producer of solar cells, of solar modules, of wind turbines, of all that goes into producing hydropower, and of all of the technology connected to electric vehicles and batteries. All of it is heavily, heavily produced in China. So on the one hand, we can't move ahead with a green agenda without China. And on the other hand, China just finished building 260 coal-fired power plants around the world under the auspices of its Belt and Road Initiative. It still continues to be the largest emitter and user of coal-fired power. Those plants are going to be operational for 35 to 50 years. We cannot solve the problem without bringing on board China and the whole issue of the increase, not decrease, the increased use of coal-fired power. Third and last sort of takeaway from me is how much this presages the conflict between those that are taking the US approach of subsidies plus, industrial policy compared to or contrasted to those that are taking a price-based CBAM approach to fighting climate change. So, again, a lot of kind of conflicts, whatever, anyway, out there in terms of what the US has done.
Thank you very much for these very thought-provoking reflections, Professor Hillman. There is one point on which I wanted to prompt you a little bit further, if I may, but only for another 2 minutes. In addition to everything that you have said, which I largely agree with, it is also true that the US is one of the countries that is increasingly viewing, or at least claiming to view, climate change as a national security issue. And I wanted you to share your thoughts of whether you think the US can and should do that, including in light of its WTO obligations, even though they don't seem to be taking them into account very much.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Let me just start with the can it. And again, this would take a lot longer analysis, but in my view, the answer is maybe. And again, I think there's three ways to think about how you could do that. If you think about it, it would have to be under Article 21 of the GATT. To me, three possibilities. One is you fit it under the provision that talks about arms, ammunition, implements of war, directly or indirectly relating to the supply of a military institution, because there's tons and tons of data out there about how all of our military, the number of military ports around the world that are going to be underwater and therefore not usable, the amount of military equipment that cannot operate above X degrees of temperature, and we're now going to have major parts of the world be above X, on and on. So you can at least make an argument that you're going to have to do a huge amount of reconfiguring, readapting, resupplying, reconfiguring all of your military establishments. So you might make an argument you could fit under that. Secondly, taken in a time of war or other international emergency. Again, there may be ways to think about, could you fit this under there? Again, you think about what is going to happen in terms of emergencies in international relations. Just take the migration issue alone that Thomas mentioned. Most of the studies are indicating that by 2050, we will have somewhere between 200 million and 250 million climate migrants who must move, either because the place that they live is underwater or the place that they live is too hot to be habitable. 250 million people by 2050. The movement of all of those people alone is enough to say this is an emergency in international relations. Just that alone, leave aside all the wars that are going to be coming over access to water. Who gets the Mekong River when China uses it all for its own hydropower, et cetera, et cetera. So you could make an argument there. And thirdly, you could maybe fit this under the last part of Article 21, which is a UN Security Council resolution that declares climate change to be a risk, a national security risk, in which point you fit under that 21C that says that members can take measures as long as they are doing it in pursuit of a UN Security Council, well, a UN obligation for international peace and security. So can it, again, does it fit neatly? No, but could it? You can imagine any one of these three scenarios being at least grounds to say yes. Should it? That's a much, much harder question. Because if you look at 21, it doesn't have the chapeau that 20 does. So once you say, yes, climate change fits under 21, there aren't the same kind of guardrails to make sure that you're staying, within some basic framework of whether it was really necessary to do this kind of discrimination. You don't have those guardrails, and it risks lots of other problems with countries that don't agree that it should be declared a national security risk. So now you've got a lot of discord where other people think that climate change should stay in the environment realm and shouldn't be bleeding over it. And once you move into national security, now you're giving carte blanche to militaries to invade other places over security reasons, et cetera. So to me, it raises a huge number of risks to go down this road. And on the other hand, my view is it's coming. I will read you just one sentence of what President Biden said at a UN, again, meeting. The climate crisis is about human security, economic security, environmental security, national security, and the very life of the planet. Everyone is starting to talk about it as national security. So I think it is one of those things that we really need to at least think about, worry about, where are the guardrails if we're going to put climate change into the national security realm.
Thank you very much, Professor Hillman. Again, I agree with most of your reflections, and I'm sure there will be a lot of reactions on them from the audience. But before we get there, last but certainly not least, Professor Gabrielle Marceau, who's going to offer some reflections from a WTO perspective, and in particular, what you think are the key issues or challenges for the WTO in trying to manage these messy responses that we are seeing to the climate crisis from various countries. We heard about the European Union, also the US, but certainly as well many others. So what do you think are the key issues or key challenges for the WTO in managing all this?
Thank you very much, SIEL, for including me, and Gracia for the questions. Yes, I agree fully with the last comments of Jennifer. And I will, in a way, sort of confirm. Well, I would say that one of the biggest challenge is not the legal compatibility, although I'm a lawyer, and I will cite two principles invoked by the appellate, but in past cases that would be helpful. I would say that the biggest issue is to make sure that it does not become a north-south issue, and it cannot be, and it's not, but also the call for comparison that is necessary if there is invocation of Article 20 that justify actions, arguably extraterritorial actions on climate change. And my question, my comment is, we know the case law on comparison. So if I take the old asbestos case, the appellate body has said, for instance, that whether you deal with Article 3.2 or 3.4 dealing with non-discrimination on tax or non-discrimination on regulation, both provisions should have relatively the same scope. Otherwise, government, if you're looser on tax, will put everything in regulations and vice versa. So that's the last point, one of the last points made by Jennifer. Some governments equal state. It's a fundamental principle of law. States are equal. Some governments will follow regulation type approach, other non-price type approach. The other part of this test came, we have repeated it many times, from shrimp, where US lose the first time because it requires that the exporting country use their method, use their net. They changed the law and they will win. Why? Because they put in place a requirement that the exporting country uses rather a program of comparative effectiveness. And let me reread this paragraph that I read about 100 times to try to understand where it could take us. Such standard or requirements, comparable environmental effectiveness, would allow the exporting member to adopt a regulatory program that is suitable to the specific conditions prevailing in its territory. So, in my view, this is going to be one of the huge challenges of the WTO, and this is not a legal issue or not even a trade issue. It's an environment issue. Effectiveness. And this brings me to another aspects of this difficult comparison. And if I talk about CBAM, it's just as an example, because CBAM is a price-based measure. But you compare what and effectiveness to what. So the case law has said you look at the goal of the measure, in the case of shrimp, protecting turtles, and you look at whether the exporting country does something that will have the same effect. So big question, big challenge. This CBAM, for instance, is the goal to deal with climate change, to reduce emission, or to avoid leakage. Because the broader the goal, the broader the comparison, the more difficult. So if the EU is clear, I want to avoid leakage, let's say in the steel industry. 12 years ago, the US put forward informally proposals for domestically a tax on steel. And I remember doing a note at the time saying the biggest challenge will be, what will the US answer to Brazil if they export to Brazil and they challenge the tax? And they say, I plant green trees in Brazil, even above all my commitment. I used to think, well, we'll have to deal with the effect of those planting trees and tax on, let's say, steel in the US. I think it was wrong. If the goal is to avoid leakage, even if Brazil plant trees, it may be very good for the environment, will it avoid leakage in steel? But there are other things in this comparison. Now I was talking about the effectiveness. The comparison, we talked about it yesterday, and there was a Colombian lawyer. I looked for her, I don't see her. I thought what she said was so wise, Maria Paula Sanchez, where in the context of comparison and price and non-price, she raised these new sort of proposal about implicit price. Explicit and implicit price together would lead to the effective price. I wonder whether the EU with its effective price got the idea from the effectiveness of shrimp. But for instance, she mentioned, and I would support that, but it's going to become extremely technically complicated for the WTO to deal with this environmental question. She said there are many fiscal measures that are in place the goal of which is to reduce leakage, to increase costs in the country, Colombia, discouraging the movement of companies from whatever US and EU to Colombia, because there will be costs here as well. Maybe not exactly the costs relating to directly limiting the emission, but maybe indirectly. And there are a long list, more and more, of this implicit and explicit sort of costs imposed in the context of fossil fuel, etc. Let me just conclude, and I will have more to say. I would have more to say. This is just one small bit, because we're all a bit legal technician. Comparison is the job of the WTO. It's a club. And the club is that you treat equally all countries that are in the club. The WTO is rarely a North-South forum, contrary to some UN. But, and this may be coming later on, when the appellate body said, suitable to the specific conditions prevailing in its territory. What? And of course, the appellate body is not there anymore, but I praise the principle. It is important that countries collaborate and discuss, and it cannot be done only at the WTO. The World Steel Association, about 2-3 months ago, asked the DG of the WTO to deal with climate change. And they said, because you're the forum that developing countries love most, because it's consensus and their right to vote and all that is equal. All states are equal. Maybe, but in my view, this is one of the biggest challenge, dealing with these technically environmental difficult issue of comparison.
Thank you very much for those initial remarks, Professor Marceau. Just very quickly, I mean, you've put a lot of emphasis on comparison, equivalence as the main challenge for the WTO, and in particular, how to put it into practice, what to compare and how, because these are largely environmental questions, as you say, rather than trade questions. But one additional challenge, I think, that comes from the environmental regime is the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. I mean, in the WTO, comparisons and equivalence are all about ensuring, as you say, that all members make equivalent efforts or comparable efforts in effectiveness. Whereas in the climate change regime, you will take the opposite position, that members should make differentiated efforts, not efforts that are equivalent or comparable in any way in fighting climate change. So if you can very briefly share your views on whether you think that principle has any relevance for the WTO and the discussions that are happening in the WTO, or is that totally irrelevant in your view? And or helpful?
Yeah. I'm not sure I agree with you that in the WTO, the comparison, and I'm talking about comparison under Article 20. When you compare under national treatment, MFN and all that, you compare like products. Under 20, you compare situations, not like products. And in my view, situation, that's why I repeat it, in light of the specific conditions prevailing in the exporting country, in my view, require a flexibility that will take into account the conditions, not of each country. That's what Malaysia tried in shrimp, but globally. Now, the CBDR principle is a principle of environmental law. I did quite some research recently to try to clarify my point. It used to be at the beginning, and from Rio to Kyoto and all that, a clear differentiation sort of principle. And it was always in the context of agreement that included linking clause, where the commitments of developing countries were clearly made, I would say, almost conditional to rich countries doing their part. In my view, this has changed with the Paris Agreement, where the linking sort of clause disappeared. Why? Because the choice was that each country will make commitments at the level they can support, a bit like in WTO trade facilitation or even services. And in fact, the linking clause is not there anymore. There's only, let me read it, this reference to different national circumstances where it's written, rich countries should go ahead and do most efforts or many efforts, but developing countries should continue enhancing their efforts and are encouraged to move over time towards economy-wise emission in light of different national circumstances. In my view, this brings CBDR in light and or even parallel to the chapeau of Article 20 that says that you should look at this discrimination or non-discrimination or justification between countries where the same conditions prevail. And I think that the EU has never denied, for instance, in CBAM or other, that countries have different capacities, different problems. But this is part of the challenge, how to make sure that the countries that deal and go ahead, because in WTO, unilateral measures are legal. And countries have the right to want to avoid leakage. But at the same time, the right of other countries that have less capacity and less means, etc. So I do think that this principle, I'm not too sure what it means exactly. That's the big challenge, but it is relevant. And that's going to be my last comment. When you look at these Article 20 situation, you're supposed to look at, are there alternatives that would do the same trick? Well, alternative is an environment question. We're going to need a lot of environment sort of expert, but also comparable effectiveness. This is an environmental question again. Whether it's CBDR or the chapeau of Article 20 or the principle that Thomas mentioned, it's all about trying to find the sort of balance that we all need. And it's not a north-south balance, at least not only.
I will agree with that. Very, very briefly, because I want to open to questions from the audience. It's already 5 to 12, although we started 15 minutes late. So can we take a bit more time before the lunch break?
Yes.
I think,
Okay, Marcus, sorry, I was looking for you.
yeah, I think it's fascinating to assess the interpretation issues in existing law, but I'd like to draw the attention that the agenda is much wider. And I think we are witnessing now a paradigm shift. And the paradigm shift is that we see fundamental changes in non-discrimination moving from the physical properties to the production and process methods. This is inherent to the principle of sustainability, and it will translate in all the areas. And in my view, the big challenge here we have to face in reviewing all these different agreements on mitigation, for example, which is essentially an energy transition effort, TRIPS, SCM, TBT, GATS, GPA, a lot of agreements are affected. How do we manage this transition in this paradigm shift? And the key to this, to make it just legitimate, the use of PPMs is the dissemination of technology. Because you can only ask people to produce in certain ways if the technology is made available to change the production methods here. And the beauty of climate change is that never before in mankind did we have a situation that we have all a shared interest to make the best technology and the best practices in place wherever this is on the globe, because we have an immediate benefit. It doesn't matter whether a battery is produced in China or in Colombia. If it's done in a clean way, we all benefit. And that's a new equation. And I think we should really build upon this. And my bet is to all of you in the room that we have to revise, we have to review all these agreements in the WTO to see whether they actually respond to these new requirements. And of course, we will continue to have litigation on existing agreements, very complicated issues, etc. But we must not lose the sight. And I think that's particularly the role of academics, who really have to make the effort to think through and start making proposals in which way we might go, so that trading community Geneva can take it up in negotiations. They will not do this work on their own. This has to be fed in, and that's one of the critical contributions to society and their members can make.
Thank you very much, Professor Cottier. So now I open to questions from the audience. I see a lot of hands already. Should we take 4? So Lauren, Lauren, did you have your hand up? Here, there, and over there, and yeah, 4, and Geraldo 5. So let's take 5 to start with, and then let's see if we can take another round. Should I do it or you do it? ¿Lo haces tú? Sí. ¿Ellos? No, señora, no.
So I've got a question for Gabrielle and to some extent Jennifer. So one point that you made was that regulatory measures and fiscal measures should more or less have the same scope. And it seems to me that there's a similarity between local content requirements and the idea of preventing carbon leakage. And I was a bit struck when Gabrielle said that preventing carbon leakage can be a legitimate policy objective, because that sounds to me like a very industrial policy, which doesn't have anything to do with the environment. So I'm not, well, I'd like to know what your views are. How on earth can you just say that avoiding carbon leakage is actually at all a legitimate policy objective?
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. Professor Cottier made the point that adaptation is a critical issue that we need to be, putting front and center, which I think in many respects is the key issue for most developing countries. But I didn't hear the panel talk anything a bit about the just transition process and how we're going to finance this. Of course, the big players are juggling for geopolitical and geoeconomic gains. Increasingly, you're going to see greater block formation. And then, so the issues of financing and technology transfer and all of those things are going to be colored by those objectives. So I just wanted to invite the panel to maybe respond to that as an element of thing. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Geraldo, and her as well. Then over there, Vera, yeah, Geraldo.
Good morning to Gabrielle or Jennifer. Look, at the old times, I studied physics. And the first thing you learn when you arrive in the physics laboratory is to get the same result, you have to have the same pressure and temperature conditions. What we are having here now, a discussion about law and principles. And my point is on the basis. That is, if you go to the global map, the Mappa Mundi, what you learn is that the majority, 3/4 of countries are above the equator. Look, the equator passed through here, Bolivia and Brazil and Indonesia. The rest is above. So the conditions of pressure and temperature are different. So the way you measure all the points that you need to know about environment are different. While, again, in tropical countries, we need to have a lot of pesticides and fertilizers and so on, if not because the insects is going to eat everything. It's different. It's different to raise a chicken in the north and the chicken in Brazil, a cow there. So the methane the cow emits is different because they are under the same place. The question is how you lawyers are going to solve this issue. The things you measure are not the same. My ton of steel is different from for the north and Gabrielle, sorry, the Carbon Club agreed not to agree. Last week, so the United States is measuring the emission of steel in the different from the European Union, and they decided not to discuss anymore because they cannot agree. So how I am the basis. of the discussion of climate. How about how the lawyers are going to solve this? And a question, sorry. How are you going to say about the deforestation? How you are going to explain to the world the fire in Canada? Tell me. Gabrielle, tell me what is a spontaneous fire and what is a fire made by men?
Thank you. So I think my question goes to Geraldo Vidigal from the University of Amsterdam. I'm originally from the Global South, so hopefully also filling that gap. So I think it goes in the same direction as the two previous speakers. So, but I'd like to ask more about exactly. So the lawyer, are lawyers going to solve this? And if they're not, then who is? So what institutions are we going to bring in to make these calculations and engage in these negotiations? I understand that the WTO, I mean, apparently, developing countries like the WTO as a forum, but for example, India has already said that it doesn't want anything about environmental regulations in the WTO, which I understand is a mistake because it's a wrong assumption that by not having rules somehow things are not allowed, but when maybe the opposite is the truth. But and then I mean, and maybe from the diplomats and the others. So what is the forum we're looking at for this here? Is it the OECD? Is there anyone who is engaging in this comparability exercise, also taking into account common but differentiated responsibilities? Because I mean, the alternative to this is a bad scenario in which a retired diplomat from Uruguay, a Singaporean lawyer, and probably Professor Cottier have to make a call on, is this sufficiently taking into account a CBDR or not? And so is this? So what is the? I mean, what is the status here? Is it as Professor Tosson just said, a situation where we'll all go it alone and eventually try to make something work out, or is there someone working on this situation in a way that also contemplate the willing but maybe not so able countries that want to cooperate but also want to feel that the EU and the US are not just exporting the burden of compliance costs of paying for climate change mitigation? Thank you.
Yes, I'm very short. Thank you very much for your presentations. Gustavo Guarin from the Colombian WTO delegation and also professor here in the Senado. So my question is less abstract and more practical, and it's actually to the EU ambassador to the Republic of Colombia. We are discussing about principles, the principle of common concerns, CBDR, and the principle of cooperation. And the principle of cooperation is embedded in many agreements, the USCCC, etc. And it's also include the issue that Professor Cottier mentioned, transfer of technology, right? Transfer of technology and capacity building and innovation. More or less related with the intellectual property. I don't want to open the debate on intellectual property, but what is the EU doing in addition to giving finance to adaptation mitigation, just in this idea of applying these international principles in practice? That's how developing country members are trying to achieve. Thank you very much.
James, do you want? No, is that okay?
Very last.
Really short, please.
Super short. The fundamental issue we are debating is that free trade requires harmonization or almost consolidated unified local regulations, but this is fundamentally at odds with environmental law, because we have this common and but differentiated responsibilities, principles, and different impacts on the environment for each jurisdiction. So the only possible answer is unilateral measures. If I want to protect my domestic industry, I want to accompany that with unilateral measures to adjust and avoid the leakage. but this has the downfall of deepening the crisis of the multilateral trade system, and also does not yield positive environmental results, but because you will increase the trade of dirty products between dirty jurisdictions. So besides unilateral measures, what can we do? That's a question.
Can I start answering? So I
1 minute each.
cannot respond to 4 questions in 1 minute.
Well, you continue, well, it's 10 past, Marcus is about to kill
So
me,
I
so
don't
1
agree
minute each.
with you that trade is about harmonization. You have mutual recognition. And I think that's the challenge. It's to compare. What we need is less lawyers, more environmentalists. And what we need is collaboration between states maybe, but I would say IGO. I'm doing a research about IGO initiative and how in times of crisis, many of the actions came from international organizations that decided to respond to needs that did not even exist when they were created. And for instance, in the late 80s, the World Bank realized environment is important. How am I going to deal with integrating environment in my opinions? Well, they're rich. They hired, I think, 83 environmental experts. They put them in each department. It shifted the movement. So as to whether leakage is or not a good politics or policy or goal, the environmentalists claim it is. Maybe it's not in this case. Maybe it should be debated. But instead of looking only at lawyers from international economic law, although they're good, I would double the number of environmentalists to avoid having to favor mutual recognition and comparison. That's the challenge.
Thank you, Gabrielle, for keeping. 1 minute.
I'll try to sum it all up. I do think there's 2 really key trends, and then 3 things that really have to happen. To me, the key trends that we're seeing in all of this is that we are moving away from some of the sort of rules, et cetera, approach to very much a standards-based approach. And within that is the second key trend, which is in the climate change space. I think you're going to see these standards have to be done on a sectoral basis. In other words, you're not going to see the same standard that works for steel, that works for plastics, that works for something else. So I think you're going to start to see all of these standards being broken down on a sectoral basis, which again, to some degree allows you to take on board some of the differences within the locale in which those sectors operate. But I think those are the key sort of trends. On the climate change side, I mean, I think Thomas has said it, but the absolutes are that we have to speed up. I mean, we simply cannot solve the climate change problem unless we marry trade tools to the climate change agenda. And where the marrying has to occur is on the movement of money, finance, on the movement of technology transfer, and on the movement of human capital. We have to use trade tools to do that. And I think there are a lot of ways in which we can use trade tools to do that. It could be something as basic as, give countries that agree to accept climate migrants under Mode 4 of GATS, give them credit under their NDCs. I mean, you could think of lots of other ways in which you could link countries opening up their GATS commitments to permit, again, services to come in on renewable energy in exchange for unequivocal commitments to actually transfer the technology, to actually provide human capital, so that when that solar plant is up and running, it is locally owned, locally run, and you have local engineers that now can spread that solar technology everywhere else in the country. So again, to me, those are the keys. Using the trade tools that we have to do those things will move the needle farther and faster.
Thank you, Gilles. Ambassador Bertrand.
No, just maybe on the more specific questions that were directed to the EU and how we see the whole issue of cooperation and particularly technology cooperation. This is the direction in which we want to go. I can give you a few, well, at least 2 examples of there's one, of course, which is our large research program, Horizon Europe, which is open to basically all our key partners, and where we basically try to bring in the research communities from a number of non-EU countries on board to basically design innovation together. But I can give you an even better example, which is we have a small program called Low Carbon Business Action that basically is sort of matchmaking agency between Latin American and European companies looking for technological solutions, green technological solutions, and basically trying to make sure that the innovation circulates much faster because they can build alliances, and most of them at the level of small and medium enterprises. These are two examples, but there's actually quite a few. And this is one of the topics that will be up for discussion in the EU CELAC summit that we will have on Monday and Tuesday, precisely how we can make sure that the relationship and the economic and green relationship between Latin America and Europe can become a relationship where you get more of the innovation, more of the technology, more of the production as well, based in Latin America and not in Europe. If you look back to our trade, I can take Colombia as an example. 10 years ago, our trade with Colombia, more than half was basically fossil fuels, basically carbon and coal and mostly. Now, half of it is agricultural products. And for us, in 10 years' time, the objective is that you have manufactured products and that you can actually get as much of the innovation and the technology here and then exporting to Europe as opposed to exporting raw materials.
Yeah. I'm actually quite confident that based upon existing WTO disciplines and principles, we are able to adjust the system. I'll give you just one example. We have an obligation in Article 66(2) to provide incentives for technology transfer to least developed countries. I was looking into the possibility of using tax breaks to create these incentives. And I think there's a good case to do that. But we would need to revise the SES agreement with its strict provision and export subsidies. And this is the kind of work we should take up and move the thing forward.
Thank you very much. So it's 12:15, so we finished right on time, considering we started 15 minutes late. Before freeing everyone for lunch, can I please ask you to join me in a big round of applause for such an engaging discussion? Thank you.
Hello. Yes.